a little so. Okay, cool. So we are joined this morning by the one and only LaDonna Sanders Redmond, who is the North Star co-founder. So when the book Collective Courage came out, she was one of the folks that started the reading group and wanted to imagine like what the space would look like if we had a black black cooperatives in the Twin Cities. And I'm probably telling this story wrong because I wasn't here, but I've had it retold to me. Brought Dr. Jessica Gordon Hart to the Twin Cities, and yeah, I wanted to think about like what the space would look like to have folks doing this work, just knowing the history, the legacy of this work. So we are in this space and in big part because of Ms. LaDonna, Danielle, and some amazing folks that imagined what the space looks like. And 6 cohorts later, here we are. So very grateful to her. And so LaDonna Sanders Redmond, Shaker Mover, is a qualified administrator of the Intercultural Development Inventory, IDI, an intercultural organizational development consultant and coach with Culminate. LaDonna Redmond is the former diversity and community engagement manager for the Seward Co-op in Minneapolis. LaDonna led the co-op's diversity and engagement initiatives that contributes positively to organizational culture, marketplace, competitiveness, and social responsibility. LaDonna is a community activist who worked on several public health issues throughout her career, such as substance abuse, violence, and food justice. LaDonna successfully worked to get Chicago public schools to eliminate junk food, launched urban agriculture projects, started a community grocery store, and worked on federal farm policies to expand access to healthy food communities of color. LaDonna is a 2003 W.K. Kellogg Food and Society Policy Fellow, and in 2009, LaDonna was one of 25 citizen and business leaders named a responsibility pioneer by Time magazine. LaDonna has a popular TEDx talk, Food Justice Equals Democracy. And like I said, a mover, a shaker, makes good trouble, necessary trouble wherever she goes. And she's here with us today. So grateful for you to be here with us. And yeah, the space is yours.
Thank you. I am so glad to be here and proud to be here to see, the continuation of the North Star Fellowship is really a dynamic, and your leadership is part of the second generation, right, of leaders. And so that is so exciting because so much of our work doesn't transfer to generations. And as you're doing your work, it's really important that you too, no matter how young you are in this work, that you think about who's coming behind you and that you're making a way and a space for them to be just as successful and thrive just as much as you are. So as you are cooperating together, make that a part of your cooperative leadership model, that you're always looking for who's next and always willing to make that space for who's next, because we want our organizations, our institutions, and certainly our cooperatives to go into the next generation as well. So, Nkuli, how long do I have to actually talk? Because I want to leave space for questions.
That's a great question. Let me just check. So we have until 11:45 today.
Okay. Oh, that's a nice long time that we have. Okay. Let me just. All right. Oh, wait, my computer back up because I have my notes on another computer, and we'll get started. My communication style is eclectic. If you have a question and I am in presentation mode and I'm talking, you can say, hey, Ms. LaDonna, I got a question. If you want to hold them to the end, you can. However you want to, however you feel comfortable. You can also put it in the chat. Usually I do monitor the chat, and if I miss something, somebody call it out to me, and I'm happy to address it. But I would like it to be a conversation, a dialogue, rather than just me kind of talking to you about this real important work to me. It was this work that I'm going to present to you today is a part of my thesis. And as I am a recent graduate from St. Mary's University in Nova Scotia, Canada, which is the only program internationally that gives a master's degree for cooperative and credit union management. So if you think about it soon, if you're thinking about going to graduate school, think about St. Mary's. I see Alicia has her hand up. Is that by accident? Okay, so I'm gonna assume that it's by accident because we're not in communication with what's going on. Alicia, am I saying your name properly? Am I saying her name right or their name right? Which reminds me, my pronouns are she and they. As we move on. Okay, fantastic. All right, I'm gonna start sharing my screen. And this presentation is called Common Thread. What I was really interested in was understanding what is the connection between race, racism, and the international principles. But before I begin, I always start with land acknowledgements. I'm not going to read this to you. We know that we are standing on stolen land. We know that the foundations of capitalism are not just stolen land, but also stolen people and stolen culture and stolen labor. But of course, I really would be remiss to not remember that we are standing on the land of the Ojibwe, the Dakota, and the Lakota, and a number of other indigenous people who were forced off of this land. And I don't want to just remember indigenous people because of the things that have happened to them, but also want to acknowledge that they're just not a tragedy. They also have thrived, and they also have recovered and are recovering their culture and their language, and also demanding, asking, requesting that their land be returned. So in that, they're not a thing of the past or a relic of the past, but very much with us, alive with us, and they should be remembered, celebrated, and uplifted. I also stand on the shoulders of those who have gone before me. I stand on the shoulders of my ancestors, stand on the shoulders of my national ancestors. So grateful to be able to be my ancestors, as they say, wildest dream. I know that my lineage of women, as far back as I can remember, maybe dreamed of the things that I could do, even if they couldn't possibly imagine the things that I'm able to do today. But they held on the idea that one day I would be as free as I am today. And while I'm not completely free, I'm freer than what they ever could imagine being. And so I stand on that. I'm proud of that. I'm grateful for what they were able to give me. I am grateful for the names that I am able to call. I'm also grateful for the names that I cannot call. Just because I cannot call their names does not mean they did not exist. They are a part of me. I am here, and I am going to live out that legacy. I'm going to make it known, and that's why people know that I cause good trouble. That there, right there. I'm going to make it known. We often begin conversations, at least in the 21st century, calling the names of people who have been killed by state-sanctioned violence, the unnecessary use of policing in our communities. And so much of this work is on the backs of our ancestors. And while I'm also a priest in traditional African religion known as Ifa, some of these people may not necessarily be ancestors, but they have crossed over into the spirit world. And so their crossing has given us the opportunity to raise the standard of care in our communities, particularly as it is around how we hold each other, how we manage conflict, how we police each other, regardless of the policing system that is killing us. And of course, the names on here, as you all can see, like Philando Castile and Jamar Cox's name is on here somewhere too. And of course, iconic name is George Floyd, which has kind of summarized, not just for the global community, what systemic violence looks like, but for us in Minneapolis to have, in St. Paul, to have lived under the event of his murder and the trial and all of the days and all of the energy around it. And I'm sure you all know exactly what I'm speaking to, is that there was a very real tension and strife and horror and pain and trauma as a result of being the epicenter of systemic racism and systemic violence. So as I begin this talk, I think a lot about those people who I read and their words and phrases come to me. And this one, along with the quote by Audre Lorde, is really one of my favorites. And it's from Toni Morrison. And I believe she was given a talk at Harvard University. And she says, "I have spent my entire writing life trying to make sure that the white gaze was not the dominant one in any of my books." And I really appreciate Toni Morrison because she was adamant about this white gaze and adamant about writing the stories that she couldn't read or couldn't find that represented who she wanted to be and who she wanted to see. And so for me, a lot of the research that I do is really about a rewriting of story. Even though I'm not writing fictional story, I do use historical methods to really uncover stories that are related to what I'm interested in. And what I'm interested in is, well, what is this thing with cooperation and why is it so white? Why do we have to keep having that conversation? And I'm not saying that we have to have the conversation, but you all know what I'm saying. Why is it that no matter what co-op you go to, particularly if you're talking about a food co-op around the country, it's all white or predominantly white? And if it's not predominantly white, it's white cultured in a way that lets you know that there's a dominant culture going on. Are y'all with me so far? I ain't lost nobody, right? Okay, good. So
Yeah.
Good. So how I'm going to break this down is that I'm going to go through a bit of an introduction, which I'm in right now. I'm going to tell you about the methodology of my research, give you a little bit of a historical timeline, and then we're going to talk about the cooperative identity. And then we're going to talk about, you know, what you need to do and what you want to do about it. Okay. So the introduction, I don't want to really spend too much time on my own background and my own history, but I'll just tell you where I am right now in my life, right? So I live in Minneapolis in the Twin Cities. I'm considering going further with my education in terms of a PhD. I really am interested in studying the ideology behind cooperation and racism. And I want to talk more about that. I'm the president of Seward Community Co-op, and I have been the president for the past 4 years, and I just won a second term. So I might still be the president next year, but we'll see, because your girl is tired and she's busy. So I don't know if I'll keep doing that. I started at Seward Community Co-op to really help them build the Friendship Store, which is in South Minneapolis. If you live in South Minneapolis or you've been paying attention to the cooperative work, you know that that was a highly contested build for a lot of reasons that I'm happy to discuss. But mainly it was, I believe, about race, racism, and how cooperatives, for whatever reason, up until that point, had pretty much ignored Black people in the community, even though they are in the vicinity of these communities. And so when Seward wanted to build this store, people were like, well, who are you? And why should we trust you? And why do we want your food? It wasn't really about the food per se. It was about systemic racism. And so that leads me to this particular introduction, which I had already started with, which is cooperatives struggle to address race and racism within the cooperative identity. So what is the cooperative identity? The cooperative identity are the 7 international cooperative principles. It is the cooperative values, and they come together to form what they call the cooperative identity. And the identity of cooperatives is how you know it's a co-op, right? It's like you see the 7 international principles, or you see the business model, which talks about the enterprise, whatever the business model is, how it's raised its capital, which is from the membership, and then how it's governed, because the members then elect a governance board to manage the membership as well as oversee the enterprise. That's a simple explanation I've ever gave. If y'all could like codify that and put that down someplace, y'all will have gold, right? But that's basically what we're talking about when I talk about the cooperative identity. So the paper that I wrote really was a historical analysis of the life of the father of cooperatives, which was Robert Owen. I had never heard of Robert Owen. Even in Jessica Gordon Nimhart's book, I don't think she talks about Robert Owen. And I was like, well, who is Robert Owen? And so when I started to look at Robert Owen's life, I found out that Robert Owen was a cotton mill owner. And this, we're talking about the early 1800s, who profited from the transatlantic slave trade. And he used that cotton, of course, in his cotton mills. His attitudes toward African people were consistent with the 19th century ideology around race, right? So the subjugation of race, that African people were biologically inferior and not suited, were only suited for enslavement and not suited for cooperation. Now, let's just sit with that for a second. So that's who people are saying is the father of cooperatives. All right. I need to see y'all faces. Hold on, let me get these grids going. All right. That's only a few y'all not on camera. I need to see some peoples this morning. If you can, turn your camera on, please do. I invite you to turn the camera on, because I need to see these people, these faces and things. Even if you're eating, that's okay, Sophia. You go ahead and get your breakfast going. Look here. Did anybody tell y'all that the father of cooperatives was a cotton mill owner and was trading cotton for Black people labor? No. Yet when I get to St. Mary's, they was trying to tell me that I had to pick him or some other dude named William King and decide what philosophy I was going to deal with. I'm going to say it again. I always create trouble wherever I go. I really don't mean to. It used to trip my mother out. She was like, how is it that you find the people that is, you always in trouble at school? Could you just go to school and not get in trouble? And it was impossible. I always had something to say. I refused to pick either one of them, because I'm not going to pick people who don't think I'm human. And yeah, and then my professor was like, well, that was in the 19th century. I said, well, if he thought it then, he would still be thinking it now. I don't believe that. I mean, maybe he would have changed, but you know, that's too much like right. Because if he thought that then, he probably passed it down. Well, he didn't actually pass it down. His sons, one of his sons was one of the folks who started the Smithsonian Museum. So these people are foundational. Their thinking is foundational to some of the institutions that we turn to for credibility. They're very credible. I mean, who doesn't think the Smithsonian is credible, right? So it's really important for you to examine the lives of these people, because their DNA is passed through our cooperative structure. So when I found that out, I was just like, okay, now that might be the reason why they're so white, because they genetically believe that I'm inferior and should not be in this space anyway, unbeknownst to them. I'm not saying that people's is actually out here in these streets trying to keep people from being cooperators. But there is something there that is a barrier invisible to us that keeps cooperators in a certain kind of space and keeps other people out of that space. So when I started thinking about, well, how am I going to, wait a minute, let me tell you something else. That was the first class. Okay, the first class, History and Philosophy of Cooperation. That Robert Owen stayed with me. So the spirit of Robert Owen must have been encouraging me to tell things, because I don't think anybody else had done this work. And I was curious about, well, how do I unearth what's behind and bring it into what's behind this genetic structure of cooperation, and then how do I bring that into the 21st century? So I decided to use critical race theory because I wanted to center race in an examination of the cooperative principles. So here you see just a few of the principles. Well, these are the principles of crit theory. Is everybody familiar with these, or should I just take a few minutes to just kind of call some of them out? I know we talk about critical race, we talk about racialized theory, but I'll just tell you the ones that are mostly important to me. Of course, intersectionality is also important. Generally, we talk about intersectionality from the standpoint of including gender and women and things like that. And it is broader than that. It includes that, but it's much broader than that, because everybody has intersecting identities, right? So these intersecting identities aren't just identities that are over there, it's that they intersect with situations and they cause particular kinds of outcomes depending on how these identities intersect. For example, George Floyd being Black, being a male, and being in Minneapolis, being poor in Minneapolis. And we can add a couple other things. He was a big man. He was a tall man. He wasn't a little bitty somebody. And he interacted with the police. That cost him his life, about this fake $20 bill that can't nobody seem to find. So anyway, I digress. That is an important intersection of identities, right? You have white police officer, male, you have multiple police officers. There's a policing mentality intersecting all at the same time. So when we think about intersection, it's helpful to think about all of the identities and how they intersect, and not just one particular gender or sexual orientation, but there's intersecting identities all around the place. The other thing about a critical race theory that I want to bring forward is that racism is ordinary and endemic. There is no such thing as a place where there's not race. Racism, not just race. Race is a social construct, but racism is what we have to deal with, right? So if race went away tomorrow, if they took away all the categories off the census tract, we would still have to deal with racism, right? Because it's a social construct, and the social construct creates the bias. I'm gonna talk a little bit more about that. The other thing is interest convergence. So when they talk about interest convergence in critical race theory, basically the principle is that white people will only respond to social justice issues that intersect with their interests. I mean, now maybe we know that like in our spirits, but intellectually to absorb that is to really understand that we're not, that there is no, how can I say, there's no heartfelt peace in here, right? There's no, oh, we feel so sorry for you, or, oh yeah, that's the right thing to do. No, it has to intersect with their interests, right? It has to benefit them in some way to create these social justice initiatives and to see them through. And you can see that in things like reproductive justice movement, right? Which is started by Black women, but the people who benefit generally from the reproductive justice movement, not just in access to the healthcare, but in access to the jobs that the reproductive justice movement has created, right? So who is the head of all of these reproductive justice organizations? Sometimes Black women, oftentimes white women. So who has it really benefited, especially when we're talking about the limited access to the full range of reproductive health choices, which include childbearing and staying alive after you have your baby. You see what I'm saying? So interest convergence is one of those topics that we don't talk about a lot with critical race theory. I would say the last one that I'm going to speak to is really kind of foundational to the paper that I wrote, which is that critical race theory allows us to challenge dominant ideology. It challenges neutrality, this question that dominant culture is neutral, that it is objective, that colorblindedness is a thing that should be honored and replicated, and also meritocracy. Yeah, Tennille said that's why we want accomplices and not allies. Okay, we do. We need people who are going to go along because that is the right thing to do, not because they got feelings about it or whatever. All right. So then this will take us into the historical timeline. And I just want to be able to help y'all kind of understand where my thinking was. And I'm going to actually show you a timeline in a second. So I talked to you a little bit about Robert Owen, the father of cooperatives. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about cotton or the plant. I have a presentation where I kind of go off into that. But what's so interesting to me, though, is that one of my family names is Cotton. And of course, they worked on cotton plantations. And I thought it was really interesting that here I am really kind of picking through history, talking about cotton and how important cotton was to the economy of the United States. And I'll talk to you a little bit about the Rochdale pioneers who codified the cooperative principles close to the end of the 1800s. And then the International Cooperative Alliance, who took up the codification of the cooperative principles. And I put here protect the cooperative principles, but it really is about protecting the cooperative enterprise and promoting cooperative enterprises around the world. And then lastly, I'll talk a little bit about the work of Ian McPherson, who is probably the last person that really took the cooperative principles, values, and identities around the world and created a tremendous amount of change. But the cooperative principles, despite what anyone's might think, is something that is changeable. So let's talk just a little bit about this whole how I put all of this together, right? So this is how the Owen connection to me is central to understanding why cooperatives are the way that they are, and also gives us an idea of the kind of work we have to do in order to course correct the exclusionary nature of cooperatives. So one of the things that Karl Marx said, and he wasn't really like a contemporary of Robert Owen. Robert Owen was kind of born sometime around the first half of the 18th century, or the first quarter of the 1800s. But Karl Marx said, without cotton, if there was no cotton, there would be no slaves. And it's not just that I'm ignoring that the transatlantic trade had only cotton in it. I'm not saying that at all, or that it only focused on the United States. Certainly not saying that either. Cotton was grown in other places. They did grow cotton in India, and there was an Eastern aspect to this trafficking of people. But I really want to stay just really close to this. So I'm setting those things aside, but because I really want to focus on the fact that Owen had cotton mills that he inherited. Actually, he didn't have cotton mills. He had a cotton mill, had 2,000 employees, and he was in Lancashire, UK. And so we know for a fact that he bought cotton from places where Africans who were enslaved worked. We know for a fact that he went to these places. How do we know? Because of his diaries and his journals and his speeches. He talks about going to these places. We know that he imported cotton from the 1800s to 1863 from all over the Caribbean. And as you can see here, you can see Guadeloupe, Grenada, Egypt, and India. He went all over the world, and he connected to plantation owners. Let me just put it that way. And his connection to these plantation owners was really around how to cut out the middleman. So it was all about money. That all of that work depended on the continuation of the transatlantic trade. Now you see I have it starting in 1450 and going to 1850. That's really what the historians say. I put a question mark by 1850 because we also know that people were still importing enslaved Africans from the continent after 1850. And we also know that within the United States, there was a different type of slave trade, an internal slave trade, moving enslaved people from the north down to the south to support the production of cotton. So going on to talking about cotton, British folks relied on slave-produced cotton for over 80% of the raw material. So while there was cotton coming from all these other places, we know that that cotton was from people who had been captured, enslaved, and forced to work for free under horrible conditions. And that was 80% of what was going into Britain. English cotton mills accounted for 40% of British exports. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the exports from the United States in a minute. But we know that that cotton was grown in the United States on stolen indigenous land. And frankly, wherever else it was grown, it was stolen indigenous land too. So if it was Egypt, if it was Trinidad, Grenada, wherever it was, India, that land had indigenous people on it before, and those people were killed, slaughtered, and pushed off of that land. And that we also know that the reason that they felt that that was okay was because of the subjugation of Black bodies and the global organization around the subjugation of Black bodies. And we also know that cotton mills in Britain had to have this cotton. It was no other industry that they had that could give them the kind of income and create the kind of jobs that they needed without cotton. So specifically, American cotton produced $115 million worth of cotton by 1860. That's 3 times as much as the country imported. So we weren't bringing in a whole lot of cotton, but we sure were sending it out. With inflation, that's the equivalent of $4 billion. So when you talk about capitalism, we talk about money, we always have these really big pictures, right? But when you start to really add the money into the equation, you can see how it drove an economy. And in the 1800s, $4 billion working like that, that was monumental. You know, today that might be something like, you know, the way that $1 billion works in our economy, right? Today, how many billionaires are there? That's a finite number, right? We know there's not thousands and thousands of billionaires in the United States, but we can name a few. The way that they were able to make money was that the cotton mill owners would give the plantation owners loans, right? And then they would plant more cotton, and that would allow them to expand, and they would purchase more land, and of course, enslave more people. So the point that I'm making to you is that these are not isolated incidences. This is a system, right? With 3 points in it, right? That you have the cotton mill owners. There's also traders in this conversation, but they cut out the traders because the cotton mill owner and the plantation owner could work together to give a great price. And if I can loan you the money, then you can go and expand and I get more cotton cheaper, right? Perfect. How am I on time? Okay, got it. I'm almost just about to the place where I want to be. So if we talk about, look at this on a timeline and we look at the 1800s through 2023, I put on ICA, race, principles, identity, 8th cooperative principle in that left column. And then going across, we know that slavery, cotton, and the pioneers, they were kind of doing their thing from the 1800s, well, beyond the 1800s up until probably the mid 1800s. And I mean, technically, if I really wanted to drag that all the way across, I could probably drag slavery, cotton, and the impact of that until maybe the 60s. The ICA was formed in the late 1800s, 1895, I think, to be precise. And then as the ICA was forming, World War I broke out, and that kind of shifted things a little bit, what is called the Great War. That shifted things, so they couldn't, go about getting together in Europe, and so they didn't meet for a few years. Then by the time they did get back together, World War II, Hitler was trying to do his thing. And so that became a huge international incident. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but not much today. And if you have questions, just let me know. But the formation of the ICA was still in its infancy in the 1930s, because they hadn't got a chance to meet. And then they had to also stop meeting again around the World War II because of the war, the Second World War. So yes, thanks for that post. The ICA is the International Cooperative Alliance. Where you see race come in around the cooperative principles is not really until the 1960s. And that is because after World War II, there was this push to get European countries out of Africa and kind of, reconfigure, if you will, colonialism into like this empire building. It was already empire building, but they wanted to, what does the British colonies, what do they call them now? Their Commonwealth. Go ahead, Nkuli.
Sorry, I was saying the Commonwealth.
Yeah, they call it the Commonwealth now, but it's pretty much the same thing, right? A friendlier version of oppression, if there is such a thing. So race is, as a word, shows up in the cooperative literature around the 1960 Manchester meeting. And I think I have a little thing about that as well. In the 1980s, they start to talk about this cooperative identity that I mentioned to you, where there's there's values and there's these principles, and there's also the definition of what is a cooperative. And that takes 15 years. So these conversations are super slow, and that's probably also because of the nature of communication. Now we are able to communicate instantly with almost everybody all around the world, as long as they have access to technology. And then finally, really coming up, I would say the past 2 years, maybe, there's this talk of having an 8th cooperative principle, which would be, people are saying like DEI, sort of as shorthand for the 8th cooperative principle. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So that takes us into this conversation around the cooperative identity. And as I promised you, yet another graph that I, a little chart here. So if you look at the top numbers, 1844, 1937, 1966, and 1995, I'm showing you the years in which the cooperative principles actually changed. Where there's an asterisk, you can see that there's a beginning of a conversation around racial hierarchy with anti-Jewish threads, right? So in the 1930s, Hitler was kind of out doing his thing. And as you know, the Holocaust and all of that was happening. I'm not minimizing it. I'm just trying to be mindful of how much time I spend talking about any particular incident. There were also German cooperators, and the ICA was trying to, I don't know that they were necessarily trying to figure out what was going on. I think there was a worldwide ignorance about what was going on in Germany, and there was a lack of care. Nobody really cared until it got out of control. And then there was this organized ally response. The point that I'm trying to make is that at one of the meetings, I think it was the Manchester meeting, where the ICA folks were like, hey, we need to catch up with these German cooperators. Maybe they should come and we can, actually see what's going on. They thought that they were talking to their colleagues that they had been talking to since the late 1800s. And who showed up was the Nazis. And they proceeded to give them like a lecture, an hour lecture on the finer points of Nazism. Okay, so now that's one thing. And I'm not saying that the ICA was up with Nazism. I am saying, though, that they took a colorblind approach to that philosophy and just kind of said, you know what, we feel really sorry for the people in Germany. And that was it. They didn't, put a call out. They didn't say, no, we're not up with that. That's not right. Y'all got to get out of here. We don't want to hear this. No one said that. And of course, you want to say again, well, the United States didn't either. Roosevelt wasn't, chomping at the bit to help Jewish people. He actually turned boats of them around in New York's harbor and sent them back. And they were killed in the Holocaust before he really realized that, oh, wait, this is a problem, because this guy thinks not only is he going to take over Germany, he's going to take over Europe and the rest of the world. So that's what got, of course, this is LaDonna's sober history lesson. So, please go ahead and fact check anything that I've said, just kind of, we get into the finer points of the exercise of understanding the history. But that is the first time that there's any recognition that there are people of difference that make a difference to the ICA. There's no other times. In 1966, that had to do with the decolonization of Africa. There were more people coming into the cooperative space. Britain used cooperatives not so much as a freedom fighting tool, but as an oppressive tool. So cooperatives sort of have a bad name coming out of Britain, going into Africa. And and there are African countries. There's a cooperative bank in Nigeria on the West Bank. There are cooperatives all over the continent. But they had a lot to work through in order to make it about the cooperation that we experience. Their cooperation in the way that is experienced is slightly different. I also wanted to point out the principles, right? So you see, if you look at 1844 and you go down to Rochdale, you'll see that there were 9 cooperative principles. In 1895, ICA got a hold to those 9 principles and cut them down to 4. In 1937, they added 3 more. And then in 1966, they dropped 2. And then in 1995, they added 1. I'm not really specific as to which ones were dropped and which ones were added, but we'll get to that in some point. What I want to give you the idea of, again, is that there was some fluidity. So when people tell you, if you should be in these conversations, oh, we can't change the cooperative principles because, that's the granite. They, cannot be changed. They can never move. They have to stay the same. They never stayed the same. They never stayed the same. And they were never the same. So some of the cooperative principles are still consistent, like open and voluntary membership is still the same. But my point is that these cooperative principles have always reflected the generation that was dealing with them. And they did not mind changing them. So even though they're codified in constitutions like in India and places like that, so what? They can rewrite those and they can add things to it if we change the international principles, because they've been changed before. All right. So where specifically is race discussed in this cooperative identity thing? Is it in the values? Is it in the principles? How do they talk about racism? Well, actually, they don't. What they do is use the first cooperative principle, which I just mentioned, which is the principle of voluntary and open membership, and references race. And how it references race is to say that race is a social construct. And so therefore, we are not going to discuss it. That's it. We're going to celebrate cultural diversity and inclusion. That's how we're going to do that. So then what happens to racism, right? If you're not going to discuss race, that's okay. I think that's fine. But you still have to talk about racism. Now, why this is problematic is because it's a fundamental misunderstanding of what racism is. Race is the child of racism, not the father. It's not the father. Wait, race is the child of racism. Oh, I'm sorry. Got a little typo. Racism is the child of racism. Or race is the child of racism. Think about that. Racism preceded race. So just because you get rid of the child doesn't mean you don't deal with the parent, right? You say, well, we're not dealing with the kid. We're just gonna keep the parentage. And remember, I told you that the parentage is Robert Owen, right? So if you don't address the racism that Robert Owen brung to, and he did some other things that I'll tell you about if we have time, but if you don't address that racism, not talking about race is not going to do anything to create an inclusive cooperative system. Are y'all with me so far?
Yep.
Good. I'm looking at the chat. Yes, convenient for those who directly benefit from racial constructs to want to exclude language related to race. Exactly. And it makes perfect sense though, right? So a lot of understanding like history is to kind of understand why would they exclude race? Well, it was because of the German cooperators. So after they got rid of Hitler, nobody wanted to talk about race because race had led to genocide. And so their trauma around talking about race, they was like, you're not finna get us into no racialized conversation because, we paying, what is it called? Reparations to Israel right now because the crazy man was talking about race. We done with that. You're not finna put that in nothing that we gonna talk about, right? And even if the German word for race, Rasa, is really a negative connotation in the German language. So you find this is true, right? We have this US construct around race. We're real clear about what race means in the United States. They are too. It doesn't mean they're not related. It doesn't mean we shouldn't have this conversation, but it does mean that we do need to understand that they want to run out the room when we start talking about race. They be like, oh, you finna try to start the Holocaust again, and we don't have no more money. We can't pay, right? In Germany, it's illegal to even say anything about Jewish people and the Holocaust. They get to arresting you. There's a whole big what do you call it? Raid. Really pulling people out of their houses because they were trying to create a conspiracy, sort of like the January 6th one. These people were probably inspired by them, but it had this anti-Semitism bent. And they hurry up and got them people out of there. They was like, no, you going to jail, and then you going to court, and then you going to prison, because we're not doing that again. So really thinking about, well, how do we have an international conversation about racism that understands the cultural underpinnings of other people and their experiences with racism? So this really, understanding the difference between race and racism is really important. And as my friend and my coach says, if you don't understand this, you will not understand anything else. You will be confused about everything else if you don't understand the difference between race and racism. So, is the 8th cooperative principle enough? I used to be kind of more excited about the 8th cooperative principle, but after I did this work, I was just like, yeah, whatever. Until we really deal with the construct, the international construct around color blindedness, we won't be able to really have a global racial conversation. We have to understand that race is transnational and is structural all at the same time. And this is not a conversation that the ICA has had. I don't believe you can get to an 8th cooperative principle until you get to talking to ICA about where they got this color blindedness from and how it's still very much a part of the way they deliberate around principles. Just adopting the eighth cooperative principle is going to do next to nothing. Well, first of all, I don't think it'll pass, but I don't think it's appropriate either. I think there has to be a racial underpinning, a racialized understanding, a global racialized understanding before we can have an eighth cooperative principle. So I'm going to come to the conclusion very quickly, which is this cooperative equity scorecard. And what I'm getting at is that we have to have a global critical race framework. It has to be able, our story has to fit in with the global story. And then the global story, we have to be able to tell the story of race through the multiple race and racism, through the multiple prisms that it's filtered through, particularly as we talk about African people around the world. So if we're talking about the critical global critical race framework, we're going to talk about two core components, right? That there's a state and there's a representation. So there is a national state boundaries, and there's representation within that are divided by racist structures and ideology. For example, immigration. Who belongs to what group, why, where, particularly if you're talking about the caste system in India, even the caste system in Japan, who are huge cooperators. Those ideologies are shaped by history and current forms of transnational racialization, right? And it has contemporary global linkages, right? So when we're talking about immigration in the United States, no matter where we're talking about immigrants coming from, so there's a prioritization of immigration, right? So people from Russia can immigrate into the United States much faster, quicker, particularly if they say they're under persecution, than Africans who are coming from Somalia, right? That's a long conversation with a really long list that includes a refugee camp, right? Then you're talking about people who are literally walking over the border, not being allowed to even say, I am running from systemic violence and femicide in Mexico or in Colombia or in Chile. No, you're not. Turn around and go back. So these borders are problematic, but we have to understand that there's a racialized component to that as well. Some people are coming and immigrating into this country and they're doing just fine. And other people who look like us are not allowed the same privilege, if you will. The production and reproduction of global whiteness is deep and unrelenting. Malleable, I think is the word that I used, right? There's a permanence of global white supremacy even in the 21st century. And so this is what we're up against. And that is why the global construct, we have to go beyond just, like I said, thinking about a US construct. We have to be thinking about this cooperative construct all over the world. All right, so what does that mean for you? Y'all trying to do y'all co-ops. I want you to think about this, right? The cooperative identity omits race because they say it's not an appropriate way to categorize people, all right? There's an inaccuracy in that statement, right? Because it obscures the truth, which is that people are racialized, right? It doesn't say that they're not, but if you cross out race, then you can't talk about racism, right? So you have to be able to talk about racism in your cooperative from every racialized body's standpoint, i.e., you have to work on your own bias. You should not be building bias into your cooperative structures. Does that mean that everybody gets to be in your structure? Of course not. But it does mean that you yourself are ridding your cooperation and not even thinking or conceiving a cooperation that's way of cooperating that's going to promote that's going to promote oppression. You have to take an anti-oppression standpoint. So that takes us back to our little cast of characters, right? Where you can see that there's this genetic structure, right? So if you have inherited trauma in your own life, in your own family? Do you ignore it? You have some historical trauma, personal trauma, your own psychological trauma. You don't just ignore it. You can for so long. But what happens is that it continues to creep up. So you can't ignore the story that I'm telling you today, just because you're in Black and brown bodies. You have to act like you know this is a part of what you're inheriting. And you have to make sure that you're not contributing to it in any kind of way. Because if you do, we will never get free. Let's put it to you like that. Never. We'll never be free. So it's not about going to work with white people at all, or dominant culture people, but it is about making good trouble where you are. It is about you knowing that you can't be biased, that you can't support anybody being biased, and that you will use your cooperative structure to challenge any oppressive tactics in your hiring policies, in your recruitment materials, all of that. You will challenge it everywhere that you go. So to help folks do this in some regard, these are co-ops who are a little bit longer. I created the cooperative scorecard. And what I wanted to do was to juxtapose cooperatives with capitalism. Now, some people would disagree with that, but bear with me. If cooperatives are challenging the way that capital is put together and challenging cooperatives, then we have to challenge what comes out of capitalism, which is racism. Racism and capitalism go together. Patriarchy, all of those crazy stuff goes together. And you have to be deliberate in challenging that. So we can have a philosophical stance, but we also need to take an organizational stance. So this is just a copy or a screenshot of some of the questions that your cooperative should ask itself. You're not doing this work now, but these are questions that you should ask yourself. Are you thinking about a DEI strategy? Now, you can call it whatever you want. You can say, we're thinking about an anti-racist strategy. We're thinking about an anti-oppressive strategy. And what are you willing to put up to do it, right? So are you willing to just talk about it? Are you going to put some money to the side? Are you going to write a policy? What are you actually going to do about it? Are you going to embed this question of anti-racism or DEI in the culture and the climate of your cooperative? I mean, and that means being really clear and very articulate about it. And that may also mean finding the right language to convince people. Are you going to make sure that people get the training and education that they need so that they understand what they're expected to do as working with you, whether it's a worker-owned co-op or whether it's a consumer-owned co-op or whatever kind of co-op it is, a producer-owned co-op? You got to make sure that what you're putting in the foundation, in the DNA of the thing that you are creating, is going to uphold the values around anti-oppression and anti-racism. All right, that's all I got. Thank you so much for your time and your attention. And, oh yeah, and I did leave a little bit of time to have some comments, I think, or questions or dialogue. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. All right, what y'all think? Tell me something.
There's a question from Tennille in the chat about, is it inappropriate to have a Black-only co-op?
I don't know that you can have a Black-only co-op though. I think we can look at people and see they Black, but we don't know if they all Black or not. So can you? I think you, I would say you can. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Here's a problem that you're gonna run into. All skin folk ain't kinfolk. So how do you account for that? Better to be anti-oppression than to be about a skin color or an unseen ideology. If race is an artificial construct, then we really need to hold it in such a way that it doesn't limit us from the capacity to do the things that we need to do. We got to have people that's down. So you got to have accomplices, and you got to have, and just because they Black don't mean they're going to be up with you. I'm just saying. So I wouldn't say it's inappropriate. I would say it's not likely. I mean, even in this co-op configuration, if people come and they're other looking people, I mean, you can look at me and see that I'm Black, right? But sometimes you look at other people and their skin is not this color. And so they are white appearing. So what do we do with that? So you're saying shared values matter, but definitely, yeah, okay. Yeah, it's really about the values. If they are up with Black liberation, I wouldn't care what they look like. As long as I ain't got to lecture you about it or correct you about it, then you can stay. But it's some Black people that you got to lecture about Black liberation. They'll march you back into picking cotton somewhere if you're not careful. What else?
Are you seeing some co-ops write their own principles and values and like ignore the ICAs?
You know, I'm not seeing people write their entire own principles, but what I have seen is people make adaptations to the principles. What I didn't get a chance to say, because I didn't want to run out of time, was that the credit union folks have adopted an 8th international principle, and they're pushing ICA to adopt one. So you can write your own principles. Here's the I would say the important aspect of this is that this is an international opportunity, right? So you want to be able to make the connections with people who are all over the world. I mean, I'm particularly interested in Black and brown folks who are cooperating on the continent of Africa. I'm very curious about how their cooperation comes together. And if ICA is the only place to come together internationally, then you got to use it till you build something else, right? So I wouldn't cut it off completely, but I think like I've applied critical race theory. You have to apply critical theory to what you do. So yeah, if you need another principle or how you look at it is differently, I think that's fine. And people do it. The Japanese cooperators, they're part of ICA, a huge part of ICA, but they also have a cooperative identity that is specific to the ethnicities within Japan. So they speak to their experience, their lived experience. Do CSAs, hold on, I lost it. Where did it go?
I can just speak it. I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Do CSAs fall under the umbrella of co-ops?
Not really. I mean, CSAs are not, they're a form of cooperation, but I would say more so not, because of the way that cooperatives are structured. But they do raise capital in a collective kind of way, as far as my understanding of it is. But that's a way of cooperation, not maybe the way that the ICA looks at it, but or even that the way that a bank might look at you being a cooperative. So I would say yes and no. Are they cooperating? Absolutely. ICA, can folks speak to the words? Okay, CSA is community supported agriculture. ICA is the International Cooperative Association. Yeah. Yeah, no harm in asking. Yeah.
Just a point. Sorry. Go ahead, Tennille. Sorry.
I just wanted to know if the ICA is an accreditation organization. Is that what that is?
No, it's not. They don't really give accreditation. What they do is they coordinate. They are, like I said, they are the place where they offer guidance for the cooperative principles. And they have the credibility because they actually took these cooperative principles from the people who codify them, the Rochdale folks, and they created this international platform to work together. So they don't really give you any accreditation or anything like that. The United States is members of the ICA through the National Cooperative Business Association, or NCBA. I'm a board member of NCBA, and NCBA and COLUSA have been around also since the late to early 1900s, and they work very closely with W.E.B. Du Bois and trying to figure out, well, how do we work with Black communities to build cooperatives. John Lewis was a cooperative developer with NCBA in the 1940s. Ella Baker worked for NCBA. So these people have been around for a little while, and they have the credibility, if you will. But that doesn't mean that that they have to be the only ones. I mean, one of the things that I'm really interested in is how do we in the United States come together to create a national cooperative business association that represents the interest of Black folk in the United States. And with the idea of connecting internationally with other Black folk and other people who want to connect with us.
To your earlier point, I forget dude's name, Robert
Owen.
Robert Owen. I thought it was funny in a weird way that he had the audacity to like enslave people and then be like, well, you know, because they're not human, also because they don't know how to cooperate in a whole country of people that were already cooperating. Like, come on. Like, come on. It's like a big like slap in the face.
Oh,
Yeah.
I mean, just the idea alone that for me, the idea that he could have a cotton mill and see how people working in a cotton mill were working in inhumane conditions. And he's also the person who coined the phrase, they say, working class. So he could see the humanity in the people who worked for him. And he could turn around and see the inhumanity in the people who were laboring under, inhumane conditions, and use that to pump up his workers and tell them that they were worse off than the enslaved people in the United States, because at least they got like food and they had some place to live. And, these, poor children and white folks in Europe, was out here hungry and didn't have no place to stay. And he made that statement over and over and over again. Willful blindness. Yeah, it was. I mean, and it was a lot of things, right? It was the subjugation of Black bodies for the purpose of exploitation. And so people chose to believe that, they really went out of their way. They went out of their way to measure our head sizes and our brains and take pictures of our bodies to justify subjugation. They went to extreme lengths to create this phenotype that's inferior to them, to just put them on top of the pyramid. They went so far as to say that there were two creation stories, not just the one that created Adam and Eve, because we all from Adam and Eve, if you like that particular fairy tale. We all from Adam and Eve. They created a second story, the creation story, because our people couldn't have been from Adam and Eve, because if we are descendants of Adam and Eve and they are descendants of Adam and Eve, then we are all connected. And they were like, no. It was something else that happened that created them. They didn't come from Adam and Eve. They came from whoever and whatever. It wasn't just willful ignorance. It was willful creation of racial subjugation and profiling internationally. They wasn't blind to it. They was up with it. And see, for me as a Black girl, really coming into an understanding of what race means to me in the United States, I don't think I really fully understand the story of racism until I was in my 20s. I started to hear that it was deliberate. They deliberately put these messages out. They deliberately created science around it. They deliberately experimented on our bodies. They deliberately shot those people up with syphilis in Tuskegee. They knew what they were doing to Henrietta Leaks, and they took her DNA and they created serums that address cancer. This is not, see, this thing here, it's not, it wasn't created by happenstance. It was purposefully created. They did it on purpose. Now, when you think about that, then you can think about what you need to do on purpose. So you got to do this thing on purpose. You can't leave nothing to chance up in this thing, because these people are deliberate. If anything, I would call it, there's Charles Mills has a book called The Racial Contract, and a part of my thesis that I really wanted to put in it, but I was trying to get out of school, y'all. So some things you just can't put in your paper. He said that they was willfully ignorant. Willful ignorance. Because they could see that people, they could see what's going on, and they were willfully, deliberately ignorant around what is it that you don't know right now about the murder of Black people by police, in the police hands. What is it that you don't understand? You have to be willfully ignorant in order to believe that everybody that's shot by the police is asking for it. They should have acted differently. So anyway, don't get me started. I'll stop there. Well, y'all already got me started, but you feel me. I was going to tell y'all something else about Robert Owen. One of the things I didn't talk to you about is that he also was very involved with utopian societies. See, something about white folks in the early to mid 1800s, they were utopian seeking people. They were always trying to find someplace else to be. I was like, what are y'all looking for? Y'all got the whole damn world under subjugation, and you still looking for perfection someplace else. I was like, what are they looking for? Laura Ingalls Wilder's father had a utopian society here in, I think it was in Wisconsin, or the border of Wisconsin, Minnesota, where he was doing a vegan utopia back in the 1800s. And, you know, people followed him for a little while until it got cold and there ain't no vegetables here in the winter. So they was like, yeah, peace out. We're not finna do this with you. Robert Owen was also about utopian communities, and had got some land in New Harmony, Indiana, and was trying to create a utopian community. In his constitution, he wrote, if you are, you know, utopia here, New Harmony is open to any and everybody except colored people. If you are colored, you could come here and help somebody, and you know what that meant in the 1800s, right? You can come in and be enslaved by somebody. That's the only way you can get in here. You could go have a utopian community over there, or you could go over there. You can even go back there and have a utopian community, but you can't have one right here. So literally, that's in the constitution. Like, you can go anywhere and build utopia, but you can't come here. He was so committed to it that there's a whole nother woman that he supported build a utopian community in Neshoba, Tennessee. It's called Neshoba. And the idea behind it was that enslaved people could work for their freedom in utopian communities, which meant that they were enslaved in utopian communities. And they put it together. Thomas Jefferson gave us some money. James Adams gave it the land, of course, stolen land from indigenous people in Tennessee. And it didn't work out. Well, the freedom that those Black people ended up getting, she leased a ship or bought a ship or whatever, and took them to Haiti, and like put them off the boat and was like, see you. That's how we're gonna do that. These people who were here, born here, probably taken from their families in the United States, just kind of like, no, you can't go back to your families, and you can't be free in the United States, so we're gonna take you to Haiti and just drop you off, because that's where y'all supposed to go anyway. Okay. So that's why. So that too is a part of the legacy of Robert Owen, the father of Cooperative. Anything else? You're welcome. It's a pleasure. Always a pleasure to talk to y'all. In the only got a couple minutes. Could y'all put in the chat what are y'all cooperating around? What are y'all trying to build? Anybody building food co-ops? Or producer farmer co-ops, urban agriculture co-ops? That's my thing. So I ask about my thing, but what y'all cooperating around? And if you don't know, that's fine. I'm sure you got an idea though.
We're still like doing the housing land, so we're still on that theme.
Oh, you still on housing and land co-ops. Okay. Housing co-op land trust. Okay, cool. You know,
I have
even
sorry.
go ahead.
Oh, I'm so sorry. My name is Jahan Thomas, and I'm from Philadelphia. And I have an art center, but it's an everything center. So we do have clothes. I do have art. I do plan to structure creativity into and weave that in. But it really is everything. And I try to organize like food pickups and free food pickups and really whatever the neighborhood needs. But I'm a visual artist, and through art and creativity is one of the tools that I'm using to assist my neighborhood.
That's great. It's so funny. Your name. I have a cousin named Jihan Thomas. That's a whole nother.
What?
Yes.
You're my cousin?
Yeah, we cousins, girl. I totally do. I was like, when I saw your name, Jihan, I was like, oh my goodness,
Oh, my
Jihan
cousin.
is up in this.
Cousin.
Yeah. I wanted. How long have you been there? How long have you been doing your artwork?
I just opened this particular brick and mortar space in 2020. I invested my stimulus checks in it, but I've been teaching art and doing art and community things for about over 16 years in Philadelphia area, tri-state.
Yeah. I want to say that I was in Philadelphia, or maybe it might have been Boston, and I'm sorry, those two are not even the same type of place. But was a collective of women doing something very similar. They had got together in a space, got a retail storefront, and they were bringing in other women's work, and everybody had their own section. And they cooperated around the rental, so that they had the rental space to have their showings and to have their space. And people were making earrings and jewelry and tapestries, all kinds of beautiful, beautiful objects. And so that's what came to mind when you were talking. All right. Well, we at time. So I just want to, in closing, thank you all for sharing this time with me. And Cooley, thank you so much. And Leanna, thank you. And all the other folks at Nexus for holding it down. It's really beautiful to see this continue to grow and flourish.
Yeah,
right.
thank you. Thank you again for joining us, Ms. LaDonna. Always lovely to have you back. And yeah, good luck with all your beautiful future endeavors, and hope to see you back again. Yeah, thank you.
All right. Anytime. And of course, if anybody wants to reach out to me, and Cooley knows how to reach me, feel free to send me an email. And if I'm traveling, it'll take a little bit, but I will respond. She'll tell you I eventually will respond. So don't be discouraged by that. All right. You all have a great day.
Cool. Thank you, you too.
Peace.
All right, y'all. We're gonna head into a 40-minute break. I'm not sure what time that means we're coming back.
we're supposed to start the next session 12:25, so people could try to get back 12:25-ish. That would be great. But yeah, take the time that you need, and thank y'all.
All right. Thank you all for sharing. Appreciate that. All right. So we're gonna move through our second portion of the day with our Nexus team, the shared ownership, they used to be the worker ownership initiative at Nexus, but they just changed their name to SOCAN, and they will talk more about that. I will kick it off to Liana to introduce Benjamin.
Sure. So Benjamin joined Nexus in August of 2019 as a team member of the Worker Ownership Initiative, WOI. He consults with business owners on succession planning and helps them explore the benefits of selling to their employees. This provides a solid exit strategy for business owners, retains local businesses, and is an opportunity for employees to become stakeholders in their workplace. Our vision is to grow and perpetuate community wealth by expanding opportunities for local business ownership. Benjamin has 18 years of experience in the cooperative sector. They co-founded the Hub Bike Co-op in 2002 and served as CEO and development coordinator until 2018. Based off those experiences, Benjamin began consulting for a variety of Minnesota businesses, co-ops, and nonprofits. He is a certified exit planning advisor and senior professional of human resources. And now I'll pass it off to Benjamin. Thank you for being here.
Indeed. Thanks for the invite. And yeah, like we said, I will hopefully be joined by my colleague, Christina Nicholson at some point, but I'll just kind of kick it off and we'll go with the flow. I am going to try to share my screen. I got a little slide deck here. Can you all see the title slide?
Yep, we can see it.
All right. So I think the plan that we heard was to do kind of largely kind of an introduction to a couple different shared ownership models, mainly cooperatives. And let's see how I can advance the slide. There we go. Our sort of high level agenda was kind of talk about all the different kinds of co-ops at a high level. And then we were going to do a deep dive into real estate investment co-ops and worker co-ops. Maybe touch super lightly on farm co-ops, just as an example. And then do either just an all group Q&A or breakout groups if you all preferred. We're not quite sure what where you're all coming from and what your interests are. So happy to play that by ear. But does that sound like a plan? Cool. Then definitely feel free, if you have questions, feel free to just chime in. I will not be able to monitor the chat, so if somebody else wants to, feel free to just, ask questions throughout also, or make comments or whatever. So a bit more about our team. There's 3 of us right now, plus we have a bunch of consultants that back us up. So the team is effectively bigger than this, but at Nexus, it's me, Christina Nicholson there, who will be joining us at some point, and Patty Villafara. So that's the 3 of us, and we do have our own specialties, but largely overlap in the area of worker cooperative development. And we'll unpack a little bit about the models we work on in this presentation. We did want to start at a high level, but if you all have already covered a lot of this, please let me know. I don't want to be redundant. So, but like talking about co-ops in a nutshell, what are they? Effectively, they're democratically owned businesses or organizations. And one of the unique elements is that they're owned equally by each person. So it's not related to like how much money you put in or any of that. The ownership is typically very equitable. What comes with that ownership? You get democratic control and democratic benefits. So the control typically is an equal say amongst the membership for most decisions, or at least to elect the board. We'll unpack that a little bit more, but democratically controlled at fundamentally, and then democratically benefiting. That is both economic benefits, but also use benefits. Co-ops are used for many things. Functionally, they can help provide cheaper housing or cheaper, higher quality food, or et cetera. So democratically benefiting in a lot of different ways. And then we've got the 7 principles. Have you all covered these already, or should we unpack them a little bit?
We sent them out in an email today, but then we briefly talked about them this morning, but not in depth.
Okay.
Yeah.
I probably, this won't be in depth, but I will kind of try to expand each one just a little bit, just in case it's helpful. The first one, voluntary open membership. Typically what that means is co-ops are meant to be open, sort of in the, like when you're hiring employees, you set up certain criteria, but then everyone who comes in can be evaluated against those criteria, whether they're eligible or not. But as long as they're all being treated to the equal or the same criteria in a fair manner, the membership should be open. Hopefully that describes that the nuances within that, but generally, you want to be able to bring on new members when they're a good fit. The second one, democratic member control. I think we've already touched on that. We'll unpack it more later. Cooperation among cooperatives is the third one in this diagram. And there is a great culture in the cooperative movement on every level, regional, national, international, where co-ops really do try to support other co-ops, providing advice, providing on occasion, coordinated, business activities. But there's a definite vibe in the community where co-ops try to step up for each other. Autonomy and independence. This is about the co-op itself being autonomous from other actors. So you don't want your co-op to be controlled by outside investors, for example. So the co-op itself is independent, but run by the members. So that would be that one. Down here in the lower corner, member economic participation. People can buy in to the co-op and participate in the co-op, and also economically benefit from the co-op. This is sort of where that one's going. Concern for community. This is as broad as it sounds. Co-ops are charged with trying to look at the big picture, not just the bottom line, and support community broadly as they see, as their members really see that defined. And that's wide open to interpretation, how to sort of accomplish that, but it's part of the principles. And then the last one, education, training, and information. So co-ops are most healthy. So there's education on 2 levels, perhaps, internal and external. Internal, co-ops really do benefit from a culture of education of new members and existing members to not only keep sort of just basic business function going, but also the culture of the co-op itself, that everyone's trying to work together, and just have that spirit. The morale, is really critical and often overlooked once you get in the weeds of trying to run a business or something. But it's super critical in the long run. And then externally, co-ops are always down to try to share publicly, with whoever's interested, like the awesomeness of co-ops. And so trying to build the movement, bring other people in. So those are the 7 principles. Last thing on the principles before I move on, though, is there are co-ops that have taken those and kind of reformatted them to be meaningful to them, to their own group. And so if you all find the ones a little too dry or that they're not direct enough, we have had groups that have actually had a pretty powerful experience in like kind of creating their own principles for their co-op. So I'd throw that out there. And we can provide some examples of different ones if you want. But moving on. So there are many kinds of co-op. They're really all differentiated by their use. And so every co-op has to have a use. Got a couple examples here. And the use is like the members, what are the members using the co-op for to meet common needs? First example, farmers. Maybe the farmers need these massive grain silos, right? Where they all pool their grain while it waits to get put on a train and shipped out and sold. Those silos are super expensive and massive infrastructure. So they all team up into co-ops. And the co-op provides the infrastructure as affordably as possible. You've got credit unions, which you're all familiar with. We got consumer co-ops. Oftentimes groceries are the most common version. Got a bunch in the Twin Cities, I'm sure you're familiar with. The newer version, real estate, we'll talk about today, real estate investment co-ops. I guess there's also old school housing co-ops, which we will not talk about today. At least our group won't. And then worker co-ops. So those are co-ops. The use for those is creating jobs, high quality jobs that are member controlled and member benefiting. So I think the next one, yeah. Super high level, like how do they work? Little diagram. The membership over here. Let's use a consumer co-op example for simplicity. All the members are the folks that shop there and want to buy a membership. You can still shop there and not be a member. That's fine. But if you want to be a member and maybe get a little bit of dividend at the end of the year, maybe get a discount, sign up, you buy your membership, and you join this circle here. Literally thousands of other people for some of these co-ops, they're massive. And what does that membership do? The main functional piece is that they elect a board of directors from their thousands of members. Has to be a majority from the membership itself, the directors, to maintain control, membership control. That board, does the long-term planning, makes sure that sort of strategic and financial planning is in place and is effective to sort of support the membership's goals of having a food co-op in this case. How do they do that? They also hire typically a manager or an executive team if it's these big co-ops, because they have to have some kind of structure to organize. So they'll hire a manager to kind of oversee the day-to-day operations. So that manager is going to, set work schedules and figure out, who's running the cash register and hire that person and all that stuff, right? That's, of course, under a big kind of umbrella of other work, of potentially even mid managers and stuff in a big co-op. But ultimately they coordinate daily operations. And they're doing that to, again, support the memberships with affordable, high quality food. Food co-ops are massive, so there's a lot in there, and a lot of opinions, I'm sure. And then just sort of reiterating a little bit about the benefits of shared ownership. Typically there is a profit sharing element, or at least a shared benefit element. If it's not profit sharing, it's sharing more affordable rent, right, for a housing co-op, for example. Increased voice in decision making and access to information. As a member, you're allowed to ask for annual reports and stuff like that. So transparency is important. It's hard to be a member if you don't know what's going on, right? And then, broadly, they strengthen communities through, that open membership concept, community participation, community control, and, broad-based economic benefits. So I think that's sort of just tying it back into a loop here. One last thing on the broad, before we dive into real estate co-ops. Co-ops are structured similarly. They're kind of a version of a corporation, and that just means that they have shareholders, which are the members. And as a corporation, financial risk is isolated into the co-op for the most part. So members enjoy limited liability protections, as in any business, of course, barring fraud or grievous misconduct, negligence, etc. And so typically what that means is their maximum financial exposure for loss is basically just whatever they put into the co-op. So their membership usually costs some money to become a member, to buy those shares. And then if your membership is generating profit shares and that still is sitting in the co-op, you might, if the co-op were to go out of business, you might lose that money, but it doesn't put you at risk to like somebody going after your bank account or somebody, that kind of stuff. So there is typical, like with LLCs and corporations, there's a kind of a firewall there. And with that, we could jump into real estate co-ops. And we were going to do Q&A at the end. Does that still seem okay, or should we do Q&A in between each one?
We could also do it via chat. So if something pops
Oh,
up, right,
hey.
LaDonna? Hey, hi.
You made it.
I did. My neighbor, I live on 35th Street, and my neighbor got stuck in the alley with a U-Haul. So it was a hot damn mess. Anyway,
right.
The other option is if y'all have a question, if LaDonna and Nicole, if you're willing to help, like just give us a heads up and we can take the questions as they come. Cool. All right. Hi, Benjamin.
Yeah, hey, I didn't know you.
You got this. I'm good,
staring-
man. I'll just do the
staring at
second
the-
half.
the
Yeah,
slide
all
deck.
good.
Cool. All right. So we'll just keep cruising then. But definitely keep your questions in mind, and we're gonna have plenty of time for Q&A and just kicking ideas around.
Can I jump in though I would love your comment on this, okay, you were talking about food. This is Kenna, by the way.
Hey,
Hey.
Kenna.
Hey, so, okay, so you're talking about food co-ops, and I'm thinking about, I'm the member of the Stewart Co-op, but at this stage, like, I've inherited the membership from my grandmother, and all I get, you know, I get the little perks, I get the magazine or whatever, I get the annual report, and I guess I could dial up my participation. But what I'm wondering if you can comment on is, you know, this idea that the members sort of provide some of the capital, or some of the way that the co-op gets started. And then as it goes and exists into time, and then new people come in that weren't around when it started. You know what I'm saying? Like, I feel like we're talking a lot about when things first start out. So I just wonder your comment on, like, being a member of a well-established, long-running co-op, and how that might, or you know what I'm saying? Just, I don't know, comment on that.
Yep.
And food co-ops are pretty unique. So we'll try to also unpack that in each of the other, in the real estate ones and the worker co-ops coming up. But with food co-ops, when they start, typically they don't need to bring all the cash needed to start the business. So they'll rally like 1,000 members at, you know, $100 a pop or something. And then they usually get a loan to start the rest of the business. Actually, Christina knows way more about food co-ops than I do. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. It's a great question, kind of. So, and this will affect like y'all starting up as well as established co-ops. So really, when a food co-op in particular starts up, when folks join as members, really what the bank is looking at is these are people that are like, yep, I'm going to shop here. So I'm going to help this co-op like make money, right? So then the co-op goes to the bank, says, see, we have all these people who are going to spend their money there, so y'all should give us a loan because we've got these people and we're going to make money. When it's established, that whether it's like 80 or 100 or 120 that people put in to buy a membership, really that's not helping the co-op grow. That is them doing a small investment in order for them to, like you get from that share you got from your grandma, like you receive those benefits. So what you get back is in proportion to what you put in. And that's a great question about non-extractive sources of financing. Back in the day when food co-ops first started and they were still getting run off people's front porches, it was a much more kind of community-based cooperative model. As they grew and they needed to have a physical space in order to continue meeting the need of the community. So that extractive versus non-extractive, some of it is about who you get your money from, right? So like shared capital started as a lending institution because food co-ops weren't considered real businesses. So the only way they could start another food co-op was to lend to each other. So it was still pretty community based. What we know as co-ops today are really different than what they used to be. And so they weren't these 20 million whatever million businesses they are now. So what you all are doing is really how the food co-ops in the Twin Cities started. They started lending to each other. It was word of mouth. Different co-ops supported each other, and whoever was doing well put some money in to help the next co-op. So in terms of a model, that's really the least extractive model. Is one co-op starts, when they do well, they invest in other smaller co-ops. So that's sort of how that model got started. I don't know if that answers all the questions, but
if we want to talk about non-extractive sources, it could be its own presentation, but
we are going to do a finance module, so maybe that's a good place for that too. Yeah.
But just real quick, I would add, if you want to see a cool model that I think, because like what is non-extractive, right? Like there's probably multiple definitions, but one model I think is actually really kind of walking the talk is Seed Commons. Check them out. And the reason I would say that is instead of having like a fixed interest rate that the co-op has to achieve to pay back, the co-op has to be profitable first. Like if it's not profitable, Seed Commons is like, we're just going to keep working with you to make it profitable. And then once it becomes profitable, which should be, you know, it's sustainable now, it's making a little bit extra, they start to just ask for some of that extra, being like, well, we've been helping you for like years now. put all this money on the table. Like now that you're up on your feet, now we'd like to sort of start getting paid back a little bit. So yes, they're still asking for some of their money back, but at least it's waiting until the co-op is really matured and ready to do that. So that's one of the more non-extractive ones that come to mind, besides of course grants. I mean, beyond that, if you can get grants that you don't have to pay back, awesome. Definitely non-extractive. But shall we dive into real estate co-ops?
Let's
Okay.
do it.
I'm gonna share the screen again. All right, can you see the title slide? Okay. All right, and we heard that some of you all are considering these, so hopefully this is helpful. I did want to be specific though, that what we're going to talk about in this kind of presentation or example is a very specific slice of them, just to keep it simple, which is just the single stakeholder real estate investment co-op for commercial, mainly for commercial development. So we're not going to talk about housing really too much or multi-stakeholder too much, but just try to describe a little bit about some of these investment co-ops. Let's see, at a high level, the co-op owns commercial real estate and the community members own the co-op. So in essence, they own commercial real estate. And why would they bother? We'll get into that a little bit more later, but like right out of the gate, it's because, I mean, oftentimes you want to see businesses, local businesses, and the businesses you want in your neighborhood, right? And support them with like affordable rent. So these are vehicles really for neighborhood revitalization, you know, culturally, economically. You know, you want, usually folks want, you know, alternatives to, let's say, I don't know, like big corporate chains, right? So these are models to do that, and then also share the wealth. So the nuts and bolts though, access to membership. Oftentimes the membership, it's very wide open. It's like whoever wants to join and can buy in. The door is open as long as you live in Minnesota or within the state of the co-op, and are over the age of 18. You can add more criteria if you want, but most of them do not. And the way they get in is they buy one share of common stock. Oftentimes you see that at around $500 to $1,000. Sounds like a lot. It is. People can buy in over time though. And most of these co-ops are trying to start, I guess you'd call them sort of finance mechanisms to allow people to not have to bring all the money to the table, and they could still get benefits. So they're sort of like scholarships in effect. That membership gives them their vote as a shareholder of the co-op, and it's one member, one vote. And the membership also gives access to investing in additional preferred shares. So this is how the co-op raises enough capital to actually buy real estate. Democratically controlled. I think we covered this already in the intro, so I might skip over this. Maybe I'll add, I don't think we covered that. I had mentioned that members mostly elect the board of directors on an annual basis. But the members always hold the ultimate control in the co-op. If they need to call a special meeting and make a very specific decision, the membership can do that. So they are the ultimate controller of the co-op. And in the articles and bylaws, there are usually other areas identified for critical decisions where the entire membership needs to be consulted. And those are classically like dissolution, like if the co-op wants to sell out or sell a property or close or, move maybe to another city, something like that. Usually those have to go to the membership, and that's defined by the articles and bylaws. What we've seen for the kind of the basis of values for these real estate co-ops, like why are people wanting to form them? Obviously there's a lot of reasons, but to sort of give a few examples here: anti-displacement of local businesses, decreasing wealth extraction. They're regenerative, so they if they're working well, they will generate enough of a return where maybe they can keep buying more real estate, and helping more local businesses. Stability for local businesses should be a priority. Providing affordable rent that's not changing, like, landlords, as you all know, I mean, even in the commercial space, they do all kinds of weird stuff. It's like all of a sudden you're like, what? Like, you're raising my rent like 2 months from now or whatever. These co-ops are really meant to provide like decent housing for businesses. Affordability goes along with that, local control and wealth building. I think we covered those already. To just unpack them a little bit more. I mean, the anti-displacement one I mentioned, people are really looking to these models to edge out real estate speculators. There's just been a lot of that in the Twin Cities, probably nationally. So there's a real concern about these just massive kind of, I don't know what they are, probably like private equity and corporations who come in out of the blue. You don't even know who they are, and they're just buying up property, trying to jack up the price and then sell it. So, we're trying to get ahead of those and get those properties locally owned before it's too late. Revitalization. These co-ops are really about kind of what you might call commercial development. So, maybe it's finding a vacant space or an underutilized space or a place where the tenant is like, my landlord never fixes the roof. Like, what's going on? Like, maybe the co-op can buy it and then actually create a decent structure, for that business. Community wealth building. It's an interesting one because there's so many stakeholders around these real estate co-ops. You've got businesses, you've got community members and investors, and then usually there's a sort of an ecosystem of partner organizations that help get it off the ground too. And you're trying to balance a lot of different stakeholders, especially between investors, businesses, stuff like that, where the business obviously wants the cheapest rent possible. The members who pitched in on the upfront want a little bit of return if possible. And so you're kind of balancing things like that. Maybe there's lease to own options for the businesses. The businesses can become members too. I should have mentioned that earlier. So you can have just individual members or business members, and they can all be in the same group, the same class. Or separate classes. We can talk about that later. Northeast Investment Co-op. So this is a local example, and it's up in Northeast Minneapolis, widely regarded as the nation's first real estate investment co-op. And since then, we've been seeing them pop up around the country. And the model is getting explored more and expanded. So their model is kind of old school at this point, but they're still around and they're still making stuff happen. And I have a little more info on them. the history is they started, I think, with roughly 200 to 250 members. Their A shares were $1,000. And so they, they raised about $250,000, plus a little bit of these C and D shares on top of that. I think they raised a total of like 370 or something, maybe all in. But that was enough for them to like buy a whole like half a block of empty storefronts, and renovate them. And what they did was they started with 3 storefronts, and they had a bakery, a brewery, and a construction company, or no, a bakery, a brewery, and a bike shop, all move in and start to operate. And it was really successful. If I can back up, you can see the bike shop over here. In the middle is that brewing company, Fair State, and that's a co-op itself, Fair State Co-op. And then there's this bakery over here. Super awesome. And eventually the bike shop actually bought out their own building. So they left the real estate co-op. And then they did another project for this construction company. So they own another building. I don't know if we want to get too in the
I have a
weeds.
question. Do you, or maybe you have some more context on like what support they received from the city and other things to be able to make that happen? Because I know that $300,000 is not enough to buy half a block, actually.
Yep. Yeah. They actually were pretty cheap buildings because they were empty and like totally like wrecked. But I do believe they got some lending, but it wasn't from shared capital, and I don't know who it was with. But yeah, they did get some loans to do the work. I'm sorry, I don't know who what the lender was. But yeah, most of these co-ops will definitely be trying to get loans to do these projects. You're totally correct that expecting the membership to float the entire cost is a non-starter. But if you evaluate a property like in a really detailed fashion, and you create financial projections that demonstrate that it's feasible economically and functionally, you can usually apply for a loan. And if you with enough work and support and etc. Planning, you can usually get a loan for these projects. At least
Benjamin,
that's our hope. Yeah.
sorry, I just added a link for NICE, which kind of like they break down their costs on the website too. So and I think they I don't know how many properties they 35, well it's 35th and Penn, but they got $660,000 funds that need to be raised, but it's like 10% membership investment, 148,000 in forgivable loans, and then 40% from the commercial land trust share of the acquisitions. But their member buy-in is like $50 for the members. So it's not like I know for them it's residential. But and commercial, but yeah. So,
Yeah, and land trusts commercial land trusts can definitely be a part of this to lower the cost. And Rondo Community Land Trust, for example, is interested in some of these models too, where the co-op might own the building, the land trust owns the land underneath it, and they're able to basically cover the cost of that land, for example. At least that's one framework. But let's see here. Lost my slides. If we want, we could talk about the different share types, but that might be a little bit maybe for the Q&A. But maybe what I'll just say, we can talk about it real quick, but ultimately, the thing to gather from this slide, sorry, there's so much stuff in it, but this A share up at, whoops, A share up at the top, that's your membership share. You can only buy one. It can be $50, $1,000, depends on the co-op. And what that A share does is, it gives you your vote. It gives you maybe what we'll call a profit share, should the co-op be profitable. And then it gives people access to these C and D shares, which if they want, they can invest more beyond the $50 or beyond the $1,000. And those are oftentimes where you get kind of fixed dividends on your investment, or at least a goal. So maybe on these D shares, you get 4% return on those year over year. And you can buy as many as you want or can afford. But in order to get them, you have to have an A share. It's part of like sort of SEC securities law that allows co-ops to do this. And you can do that without, normally in another business where you to do that, you'd have to hire a lawyer and pay them like thousands and thousands of dollars to help you set it up. But co-ops get a special exemption where they can sell these kinds of shares to members. So let's see. Last slide.
Question, class structures and shares from Mujahid.
Yeah, I can't see it. Let's see here. Class structure. Oh, membership classes, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, if you want, so the type of co-op we've looked at so far is a single member class where all the members are in the same group. They all have the same buy-in, eligibility, voting rights, etc. But if you want to have more than one class of member where they have different buy-ins, different voting rights, different profit shares, you can do what they call a multi-stakeholder co-op, where you have more than one type of member. It would be like, maybe if we go back to a grocery store, it'd be like you have your consumer members, but then the employees can also buy in as employee members and get some kind of unique employee benefit or something, right? So that would be a hypothetical example. I think there's only 2 or 3 of those in the entire country, but that does exist. Not in the Twin Cities that I know about, though. Does that answer your question, or was it a different question?
Can you answer maybe a clarifying question, which is, we talk about this being democratic and we talk about one share, one vote. So then we start talking about classes, right? So it's not a class system per se, but it's groups of people. So why in a democratic system would you have groups of people that aren't allowed to vote if this is purportedly a democratic system?
All classes are allowed to vote. Actually, they have to be allowed to vote.
So, but in the example, the B, C, and D says non-voting.
Oh, those aren't classes. Those are share types. I'm
There
sorry.
you go. Mm-hmm.
We can get back to that. Maybe I mislabeled the slide. These shares.
So
Yeah,
what
these
is-
are not classes. These are preferred shares and common stock shares. So A shares are common stock shares, which means that you get voting power. B through D, those are preferred shares, non-voting. It's sort of they call it equity light. It's like you do technically own like additional assets in the co-op, but you don't get to vote on them. So, and there's a lot of different things to like within that, but ultimately classes in a co-op, at least in my experience, are typically referring to membership classes. And if there's one membership class, it's easy, you know, they all get the same vote, get the same, etc. rights. If you have two classes, there's actually, as far as I know, a very flexible open space to say consumer members get 40% of the vote, employee members get 60, adds up to 100. It doesn't matter how many members are in each class or how much money they brought to the table. It's just the way that the co-op structured. So you can set arbitrary kind of balances of power in a multi-stakeholder. Takes a lot of, they're complicated. Most people are a little hesitant to tackle them because they are complicated. But they're also awesome because you can get so many people involved. So there are some really rad multi-stakeholder co-ops. And in this slide, down at the very bottom, EBPRC stands for East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative out in California. If y'all will definitely, I'm sure, talk more about them, right? They're probably the most radical real estate co-op out there. We're trying to learn from their example here locally. And my opinion, of course, but
sorry.
and they're multi-stakeholder. Sorry, that's why I bring them up.
Okay, so chat question for the so meaning you can't pay for more influence / votes. That's from Kenna.
Correct. Yeah, because that's what makes co-ops different from like big other like standard corporations. You bring more money in like our status quo, you know, big corporate America. You bring more money, you get more power. In co-ops, it's one person, one vote. You can only buy one membership share, and so you only get one vote. Does that answer your question? And maybe what is confusing here is, again, you can buy other preferred shares, but those aren't membership shares. Those are preferred stock, non-voting. You can buy as many as you want and can't afford, but they don't give you extra power. And that can be done even in other kinds of co-ops, worker co-ops, all of them. Those shares are not exclusive to real estate. All right. This is
what is EBPRC?
Yeah, that's the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Co-op that I mentioned. I'll just type it in. So it's can I even? Oh, I have to type it in when I'm not sharing. But yeah, East Bay, look them up. They're super cool. Super cool. I think what I want to pull out from this slide really is the third one. Due to the manifold values of these real estate co-ops, investment returns are typically not a priority. And I think that's important to mention because investment is in the name of them. But to be honest, the way that I think they're really meant to exist is they're not for investment returns. They're for like investing in the health and wellness of your local economy, like supporting local businesses and stuff like that. So investment returns are typically kind of constrained because you don't want to be extracting wealth from your neighborhood, you know, so you don't charge a bunch of money. So there's a lot of like balancing to be done. You do want some, of course, but it's just a balance. So and then I guess the fourth one's kind of interesting. Like once you've purchased in one of these models, once you've purchased real estate, you have a lot of debt typically because you can't do it all yourself. And with that debt comes obligations. Usually a lot of your cash is going to pay it off, you know, or pay for just keeping the building with a roof that doesn't leak. So it can be hard to create enough cash flow to let members exit. We've heard Northeast comment on this, for example. And so it's just trying to, you know, flag things to think about, ways that theoretically you could do it to get member cash back out to folks that need to leave. Maybe they're retiring. They're like, I need money to retire or something. The co-op could either replace them with new members or theoretically refinance the building, and maybe get some additional liquidity that way. Of course, by taking on more debt. So that's a tough one. Just trying to be real though. There's a lot of challenges always in the paradigm we live in. I'm going to leave it at that. If we really want to dive deeper, we've got other materials we can get into, but I hope that was helpful. I think that covers most of it. We could take a few more questions real quick, but otherwise, I think next up is the worker co-op section.
Yeah, and definitely keep them coming in the chat. Y'all's questions are fantastic. It's really great. So, hi everyone. Apologies for being late. I'm Christina, and I'm the finance developer for cooperative finance developer for SOCAN. So, I'm going to jump into worker co-ops. Given that we're in space together, I did want to say a couple of things that there are a lot of different kinds of worker co-ops, and always I'm looking at this lens of worker cooperatives through how do we disrupt our current system of white supremacy, right? So the ways that I think about worker co-ops are really about disrupting those dominant culture patterns of individualism, power hoarding, right? Wealth equaling more power, more say. So really trying to disrupt that model. The challenge is, right, white supremacy is in everything that we eat, breathe, sleep in, sleep on, right? So, and we're humans. So the idea behind worker cooperatives is really to help us, I think, learn how to manage conflict in healthy ways and learn how to show up and care for one another within a structured environment, and learn how to be the leaders that we need to see, right? So, and it is not about perfectionism. It is about the agency that we can build together and really support seeing one another as leaders. So I'm going to try and move through this worker co-op presentation pretty quickly. And plus, come on, we're coming after LaDonna, so I don't know that I got anything to say that she hasn't covered even better. But let me get into that and I will share my screen. So make sure. And I'll look to you all. Liana, Nakuli, is this good? Can you all see this? Cool. Okay. So worker cooperatives exist across the country and across the globe. As we all know, there are a number of informal worker cooperatives that happen in community all the time. These are more formal.
I don't think you're not in presenter mode though.
Oh, let me see here. So
It's just hit slideshow in the upper right hand corner.
this one.
Yeah.
Boom. Okay. So there are worker co-ops all over the US. Thanks, Benjamin. This slide talks a little bit about average revenues under $300,000. On average, they're about 5 years old. The top to bottom pay ratio, meaning the pay behind the most senior staff person and the newer staff folks is 2 to 1 compared to corporations where we know it can be up to several hundred difference between the top and bottom ratio. So that is to say 6,000 workers, over 600 businesses, about $280 million in revenue. So there's a lot of opportunity for growth in this community. And it's an exciting and burgeoning model. So again, just some stats in the US, we're now up to about 600 worker cooperatives, approximately 7,000 workers. The largest worker co-op in the US has more than 2,000 employees, and that's the Home Care Associates Cooperative in the Bronx. And again, the idea is similar to real estate in that it benefits the original owner who the workers purchase the business from. If this isn't a startup, if this is an existing business that the workers purchase, it keeps the business going, it keeps folks employed ethically, and helps the community keep jobs and businesses anchored in the community. So here are some attributes of worker-owned co-ops. They are owned by the workers have a vote in governance, they share the profits if there are profits for the business. They have transparency into the financial performance of the business, so everybody knows what's going on. You don't show up one day and the doors are locked. You're not working at, Microsoft one day and the next day you hear on the radio that 10,000 people are being laid off, right? And then there's also kind of a flexibility around the management structure. It can be both more traditional, hierarchical, can also be more participatory. And there's a number of models that have more, what I would say is like horizontal integration of decision making. What are the member roles? All employees can apply for membership. All the members who are the workers, right? So worker owners are members, do the day-to-day business operations. You don't have to be a member if you don't want to be. You can just be a frontline staff person or a staff person. You don't have to join. Also, the members or the workers elect the board of directors, and the board of directors, the majority is always the employees of the business. And then you can vote on certain issues. So again, articles and bylaws, when you create them, are sort of the rules of the road. How you want the co-op to be formed, how you want the different roles within the cooperative to interact, how you want the accountability to function in terms of what decisions are made by the board, maybe strategic decisions about like how you want to grow, how much of your profit you want to retain to grow the business, how much you want to distribute. But issues such as, are we going to buy a new building? Are we going to close co-op? Those kinds of decisions go to the whole body of worker owners. So eligibility, whoever writes the articles, and typically that's a steering committee or a transition team if it's an existing business, you set the minimum requirements. So none of these are made externally. You can look to other co-ops for examples, but you all make those decisions. So a possible scenario, so we worked with a local co-op called People's Canvas. They had to read the handbook to make sure that they understood what it meant to be a participatory member of that worker owner cooperative. They have to be recommended from another member of the co-op or a supervisor, like, hey, this person shows up, they help me when I need it, they say they're going to do something, they do it, that kind of thing. Sometimes to have an intention to stay for an amount of time. So sometimes there can be like a 3 month to a year sort of period where you're getting to know the ropes. Then you can become eligible for a member, and they may ask, hey, if you're going to be a member, can you at least stick around for a year? And then complete basic and deep canvassing trainings. So again, because of the nature of this particular co-op, People's Canvas was a canvassing organization. So they want to make sure everybody had all their training and understood the organization and its ethos prior to becoming members of the co-op. So buy-in, again, that's money that a worker pays to become a member. Always one vote in governance, so one person, one vote, right to receive profit sharing. Price is meant to be accessible but still meaningful, returned when someone leaves the co-op. And then People's Canvas, for example, did 500. It can be 100, it can be 1,000. Again, the group who is organizing to create the worker owner cooperative does a draft, the articles and bylaws. They take their best guess at what would be a reasonable amount. And then over time, if for some reason that changes, it can be changed in the articles and bylaws. Profit sharing, we've kind of worn it out. It's basically a formula. It's typically profit sharing can be voted on by the entire membership in terms of distribution, can also be determined by the board, who again is made up of worker owners. Some examples: co-op missions and values. So Union Cab Co-op in Madison, safety and health of members and public are of paramount importance. So again, Equal Exchange is another worker owner cooperative. And so these are all examples of like, what are the drivers, right, for these cooperatives? Why do they exist? They exist to serve the workers of that particular business, but typically there's also some core values that drive that business and drive people to want to join the co-op. And so the other thing, and if there's questions, I'm going kind of fast because we've been yanging for a while, and I want to make sure that we have some time to talk. One of the things that we know about the groups that are a part of this cohort is that there are folks that are interested in looking at some examples of farm cooperatives. So we wanted to include both with real estate and worker owner, because those are two models that may come together in a farming cooperative. We wanted to just show the range and flexibility of co-ops. So we just have a couple of models designed here that we wanted to share. And we have worked with, Benjamin did most of the lift, so please jump in, Benjamin, with some local folks who are looking to purchase land. That particular land purchase didn't work out, but there's always opportunity, right? And so this is one model for a farm co-op model. And this shows the farming entities. So you could have folks on a piece of land, some are raising goats, some are doing more conventional crops, some are doing an added value for, you know, example, hand creams, other kinds of things. So these different farming entities are members, they elect membership from the farmers, they form the board of directors, and then there's a farm supervisor, right? And then the farm supervisor supports the staff that's working on the farms. Whoops, I went back. So then the other one is a multi-stakeholder co-op example. I thought this might add a little value to the conversation because Benjamin did a great job of talking about this concept of multi-stakeholder. So this is if you have multiple farms, so you could have 3 or 4 different farms operating in a specific geographical regions, and all those farm entities could be members. So when Benjamin touched on that silo example, that's an example where these farms are their own entities, but they're contributing to a larger cooperative. That can be for distribution, to bring some costs down, to get products to market. It can be for a number of reasons. And then again, they're electing their membership from the farms. The board of directors, who are comprised majority of the farmers, hire and supervise either a farm GM or farm managers, and then they help run the day-to-day of the farm. So that's sort of how that cycle of democracy works with this model. All right.
And that's the last one.
Yeah.
I think that one, we might need to rework this one to be a little clearer, but
Okay.
It is also kind of an example of just how you can have co-ops that are members of other co-ops, which, you know, so off to the left of the slide. Yep, there's a co-op inside of this group where the other farm entities are not co-ops. Anyways, not to get lost in the details, but yeah, you can layer co-ops, I think is maybe the take-home message.
It's a good message.
Sometimes those are called secondary co-ops.
So those are at a high level. We just wanted to provide either some breathing room or some time for questions, or if you all have any particular questions with the co-op models that you're working with. We've got about 10 minutes left. So we just wanted to see if anybody had any questions.
I could return to a previous question. Someone was asking about Northeast Investment Co-op. I was able to look it up. It's not a ton of detail, but they definitely did get a local neighborhood bank to support them. It sounds like the city perhaps pitched in a very small amount. And then maybe it's unclear what it refers to. It may be like a nonprofit or something, some other organization pitched in. So they did have 3 financial partners to get their co-op off the ground. So
I recently went to the Northside Business Luncheon, which was about commercial real estate. And then 2 people from the city were there. Oh, wait, Queen Latifah, I'm feeling your background. Whoa,
Thank
what?
you. Thank
That's
you.
a freaking classic. Is that signed? What?
Yes, yes, that's a whole conversation,
Cool.
Kenna.
Okay, so, but the thing they were saying there, okay, because I went there and I asked my building for a $1 question because I know they used to do that type of stuff. And they were saying they don't do it anymore, but what they do now is they'll be like, oh, it'll be like a $300,000 cleanup agreement on a site that the city owns that's like really trashy. And then they work with the developer to be like, okay, we're going to do this. And then they were saying like right now, the city of Minneapolis is really trying to say that they are about writing past wrongs, basically. Like they're verbally saying like, shit was inequitable on purpose in the past. We're acknowledging that and we're trying to put programs in place to like do, I mean, they didn't say reparations, the word reparations, but I'm not remembering the exact language they were using, but it was some pretty explicit language that I don't for from like city staff and programmers. And I'm happy to go back and find all the information I got at that. I will send over to y'all, Cooley and Liana, and then y'all can spread it out to the other people that are, everyone who's in Minneapolis. Like it definitely applies to you. And people that are not in Minneapolis, like maybe it's just a seeing of, oh, okay, this is how Minneapolis is doing something. So then you kind of seek out that in your own space of what are they trying to do.
That's great, Kenna. Thank you.
And is this a new question? It says, does the city steer projects like that because of their investment, or has that been covered?
Yeah,
I know
that
right
was
now
my-
what they were talking about at the, oh, sorry. Okay, what they
No,
were
go
talking
ahead.
about at the luncheon was like there's city programs to fill the funding gap because, you know, banks will not give you your loan if you're trying to do a business in North Minneapolis, you're trying to get property, commercial property. The banks are skittish to give you the money. So the city is filling in the gap between what you have and what you would be able to get in a loan. And sometimes that stuff is grants. Sometimes it's like you were saying, only forgivable after you done started making a profit and everything's good. Like they're, you know, in word, they're saying that they're trying to like, you know, make some other things happen for Black and brown is words that they use, you know, North Side, local, you know, women owned, whatnot. And then I also just do want to name though, like right now we have a situation in our city where we have a Black owned property, loft, community, whatever it was supposed to be that we all thought was supposed to be so great. And now like that there's problems structurally and people are experiencing homelessness and really suffering. Like we're having to call into question some of the beliefs that we held about what people were doing, or like some of the foundation, the little, what is it, the nonprofits, you know, the way they fund stuff and how they like give value to stuff by funding it. And then it's like, actually is the person have the capacity to, you know, house the folks or grow the food or, you know, have the apartment building or have the whatever it is. So.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, from my perspective, the city doesn't really steer much of these, like for the projects we're talking about, the city is more of a support role. And I had something else, but I forgot. Oh yeah, and that if you are looking for additional funding sources, it goes way beyond the city. I mean, there are so many. It's complicated, of course, but there are many avenues to investigate, like county level, state level, even neighborhood, like CBDG, community development block grants back in the day. I mean, I am not an expert in that field, but I do know, like, in talking with people in the ecosystem, there are many theoretical sources of funding. Of course, the reality, as we all know, of getting it is still less than stellar. But as we push on these projects, I mean, you got to try everything, you know. So when you're looking for funding, I'm just advocating, look broadly, talk to networks. Yeah.
So for the non-extractive, so I'm still going back to that because that's gonna be like our upcoming session in March. I don't know what date. I know you're all
Mhm.
invited back for that. And I think maybe shared capital too, but I think that's like a good thing to think about as we move forward. But like, what all other things have you seen too? Outside of loans and maybe, I don't know, grants for cooperatives. What's feasible? Yeah.
Oof. And what kind of co-ops are you talking? Like
Housing,
housing?
land, commercial, like what?
I know that housing has a lot of specific supports, you know, especially affordable housing, but I haven't played in that area at all, so I personally can't answer that. For real estate and worker co-ops, let me think. Beyond loans, I think it comes into, I mean, these are somewhat theoretical too, but if you can use those preferred share types where the person, you know, a member doesn't have to, or a member can invest additional amounts. I mean, those could be utilized by like a nonprofit, for example, to do what they call program related investments, where they act as an investor. It's not a loan because they're buying equity. Oftentimes it comes with strings, of course, but in the capital stack, it's treated differently. And it's usually less burdensome than a loan by a lot. So that would be one that comes to mind. Do you have any, Christina, that you want to raise up?
I was more thinking like, and some of the advantage of that is it's treated as equity and not a liability. So it allows you to leverage your balance sheet a little more to pick up more capital if you need it. Not really. I mean, outside of individual investors and sort of building out those relationships with nonprofits, I mean, they are lenders. CDFIs tend to sort of operate in a different space than traditional lenders. So community development financial institutions are continuing to sort of figure out how they can serve this need with a range of interest rates that are lower than traditional lenders. So it is going to be a capital stack, and there's always going to be these different pieces to it. So I think a lot of it is building out relationships, having your vision, having your steering committee or your team, and really starting to kind of talk about your story in as many spaces as possible. So when people hear it, it's a compelling vision and they can start to work their networks too. But to your point, Nicole, I think this is an opportunity for us to kind of look and come up with some examples and bring those to that March meeting. So yeah, we can dig and see if maybe there's some other opportunities we're not bringing to the table today.
It did occur to me, I mean, there's crowdfunding. And there's
Yeah.
a bunch of versions of that too. There's beyond Kickstarter, there's like Minvest and types of crowdfunding that actually act more like investment than just donations.
That's a good
The
one.
donations are cool. Oftentimes it's still a ton of work because you got to like sling t-shirts all the time. But I think these days there are an overwhelming number of theoretical sources. It's just hard to know which ones to prioritize and what the burden actually will be to implement, because it sounds like Kickstarter sounds great, people just give you money, but then the reality of actually doing distro on all the obligations you set yourself up for can be quite a lot. So maybe I'll leave it there, but yeah, we can bring more ideas to a further meeting. And there's also other models like community investment trusts, CITs, which honestly confuse me still, but they exist. You can look at that. Yeah, there's EOTs for employees. Those also confuse us. We don't touch them because they're too complicated. But we know people who do, if you all decide to go that way.
Yes. Great. You really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you both. I think thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate. I think there's a lot of information today. I don't know how you're all are feeling. I know LaDonna has some evaluations for us, but I think as Benjamin was mentioning the story and creating the narrative, that kind of leads into some stuff that LaDonna and I were thinking about in terms of like the final projects and stuff that we will be talking about too in the few weeks. So please keep that in mind as you continue doing this work. But one thing I did want to mention before we went into the evaluation is that we do hope to set up some one-on-ones. So you will be receiving something from us in the next few weeks. And also we'll be having our second Black Study session on the 1st of February. We'll be having Jamal from the Northside Investment Cooperative Enterprise and also Oma Friella, who's with the Collective Diaspora. So yeah, I know there's a lot of information. I don't want to throw some more information at you right now. So all of that will be coming via email. But yeah, thank you so much, Benjamin and Christina. And I'll pass it back to LaDonna.
Thank you. And again, thank you, Christina and Benjamin, for being here, sharing space. It's always great to have fellow Nexus staff with us. So I know we've had a lot of information, a lot of things sitting, and I want to honor that. So I just invite you, if you haven't, just to take a moment to just take some deep breaths and just kind of feeling that with yourself. So I'm going to turn my camera off too, so I can feel that, but just take some deep breaths, giving some love and attention to areas of some tension that you might be holding, and just allow yourself to release that. So just on your own time. Be doing some head rolls if that feels accessible to you. Just to really allow the breath to kind of come back and lead. And also maybe just a nice stretch if that feels good to you now. just to really allow it to flow. All right. And just again, maybe one more if you haven't done 3. I like to do things in 3 sometimes. So inhaling and exhaling. All right. So I am going to drop the link to our post session survey. We can take maybe the next 5 minutes if you have time, if that's accessible to you now, to fill it out. But also if it's not, that's okay. We'll send it later as well. So let me drop that into the chat. But I'm gonna bring my camera back on. But yeah, I can thank you. I know we're sitting with a lot, thinking about a lot. And so I also wouldn't mind giving us some time back too. We can just, if anybody has any final words they want to share, that could be a closing that we could do, just like a 1-word share out of how you're feeling now before we close our time. And then folks can hop off. I'm gonna stop the recording because I don't think we need to have that.